Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our webinars. Today's topic will be Are Platforms Curbing Disinformation? Scientific Cross-Platform Evidence from 6 Very Large Online Platforms. I see that people are joining, but maybe let's wait for a moment longer. Okay, while we're waiting for more people to join, welcome everyone. My name is Katrina. I'm a part of the policy team here at EU Disinfo Lab is an organization gathering knowledge and expertise on disinformation in Europe. And a part of our mission is to give space for experts from various backgrounds to share their knowledge with the rest of the community. And that's why we organize these webinars now almost on a weekly basis. You can find more information about our past and upcoming webinars on our website and by subscribing to our newsletter. Now, before we dive into the topic, let me remind you about some of our housekeeping rules. So first of all, this webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded on our YouTube channel and our website. The language of this webinar is English, but you can turn on translation and captions, and you can find this option under CC in the bottom right corner of your screen. Now, after the presentation, we'll be having a Q&A session, and for that session, we'll be using Slido and not Zoom chat. You can access Slido either by scanning the QR code you see on the screen or by going to slido.com and using code #disinfo. I strongly encourage you not to wait until the end of the session to ask your questions, and you can submit them at any time during the presentation and they will be answered at the end. To try out Slido, we'll start with our usual icebreaker questions. So I'll ask you to fill out a short poll. So first, where are you joining us from today? Okay, France, New York. Brussels, Italy. It's Brussels. I'm also joining from Brussels today. We have Brussels and Amsterdam strongly represented today, it seems. Okay. As people from all around the world are joining us. So from New York. And we'll have another quick question on what sector are you representing here today? Yes, I see a lot of civil society and academia, and also some business, media, and diplomacy. Good. So I hope we will have an interesting discussion at the end during our Q&A. So before we start, let me introduce our speaker. So today's topic will answer the question, how much mis and disinformation people see on major online platforms, and how do accounts that share such content perform. We're very glad to have Emmanuel Vincent with us here today. He's the founder and executive director of Science Feedback, which is an organization that checks the accuracy of information in areas like climate and health and analyzes how platforms respond to misinformation. He also holds a PhD in climate science and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at MIT, where he studied hurricane-climate interactions. Science Feedback with partners has released a first measurement of structural indicators across 6 very large online platforms in 4 EU member states. And today, Emmanuel will walk us through the results of their study. He'll also talk about the ongoing challenges researchers face with access to data and the importance for developing the structural indicators envisioned in the European Code of Practice on Disinformation. The floor is yours. You can start sharing your slides.
Thanks, Katrina, for the introduction. So I'm sharing my screen now. Please let me know if you see it or if there is any
Yes,
issues.
we see it.
Okay, thanks a lot. So thanks everybody for joining. And let me first introduce myself. I'm Emmanuel Vincent. I'm a climate scientist by training. And as you all know, climate is one of the topics where there is a lot of problematic information, disinformation, misinformation, misrepresentations. And this is why I've founded Science Feedback, a non-profit organization that helps the scientific community respond to misrepresentations of science. And we are, in addition to publishing verifications, of what the science says in response to viral claims in the media and on social media, we are also leading studies on the topic of mis and disinformation to quantify how much there is and what kind of evolution of this problem is happening. And we are doing this on the media itself. So you can find on our website in the investigations rubric an investigation about climate misinformation in the French TV and radio, for instance. And another large study that we led in 2025 is this one from the SIMODS project, measuring how much mis and disinformation there is on the very large online platforms. And this is what I'm going to present in more detail today. So first, a little bit of a reminder on the scope of this project, SIMODS, the structural indicators to monitor online disinformation scientifically. So if you don't know, if you're not familiar with structural indicators, they have been defined in the Code of Conduct on Disinformation, the European Code, with the goal to assess the scale of information disorders and also to measure how it evolves over time. So, so that we could measure if the code has any impact on the platforms and about the policies that these platforms could develop to deal with the issue. So this means that these indicators of disinformation need to be comparable across platforms and over time. They need to be stable over time. So it's quite challenging to design indicators in such a way, and I will show you how we did to succeed in this development. So one of the three main aspects that differentiate our approach compared to what has been done in the past is that we work with fact checkers, so we don't rely on anybody else to define what is mis and disinformation. We ask fact checkers in the countries where we partner to tell us, what content is false or misleading online. And so the partners are listed here. So Science Feedback, my organization, is doing the work in France. Neutral is doing the work in Spain. Demagog in Slovakia, and Pravda in Poland. So these are some of the partners in this project. And then we also have scientists from the University of Oberta de Catalunya to help us with the methodology, to help us with making sure that the measures we develop are statistically robust and strong. And finally, we also partner with Check First, a tech company that helps us collect data at scale. So this is also something that differentiates our approach compared to previous ones that attempted to measure structural indicators, is that we rely on pretty large data sets. And finally, the project is supported by the European Media and Information Fund. So it's not the European Union money, right? It's an independent foundation that is supporting the work. The scope of the project is to measure 4 structural indicators. I'm going to tell you about the first 3 here, prevalence, the sources of disinformation, and its monetization. And we are covering 4 European countries: France, Spain, Poland, and Slovakia, which is the same coverage as the previous measurement of structural indicators that was led by TrustLab, which you can find on the European website for the Code of Conduct on Disinformation. So we wanted to be able to compare our results with existing results. And we cover the platforms that are labeled as very large online platforms in Europe. So these are the ones that have more than 45 million active monthly users, and they are listed here. And today I'm going to tell you about the first measurement period that happened mid-March to mid-April. But the project scope is to replicate this measurement a second time. So we have collected the data in October 2025. We are almost done with the labeling of the data by fact checkers, and we still need to do the data analysis. So the first step in leading this work was to obtain the data. We need to obtain the data to measure how much mis and disinformation there is on the different platforms. So there are two ways we obtain the data. I mean, ideally, all the platforms will be on the left under what is called method 1. And so in this, we asked the platforms 3 months ahead of the data collection period for a sample, a purely random sample with no topic attached, anything on their platform, of 200,000 content per country, or an API access that would allow us to do the same thing. So the only platform that provided such a sample was LinkedIn for the first period. And all the other platforms basically ignored our requests and subsequent requests for data. And TikTok provided an API access that is not really perfect, but that allows us to do more or less the work. But that was too late for this first measurement period. So we have on one side LinkedIn that provided the data, and on the other side, all the other platforms are under this method 2, which was us obtaining the data by searching a list of keywords using their own search engines. So, we go to YouTube, we go to all these different platforms, and it's actually check first leading a lot of this work by installing little servers in the different countries that perform the search so that it mimics the results that a local user would get. And to cover the topics that are of interest to us that are listed here. So the topics have been chosen by the fact checkers to be representative of conversation that's happening across Europe, and that is both the topic of misinformation, but also of legitimate information. So the topics are the war in Ukraine, health and medical topics generally, climate change, by extension also all the discussions about climate policies, then the topic of migration, and finally one that is more specific to each country, which is around national politics, basically the names of politicians or scandals that are ongoing. This kind of keywords would be used. Now, to be fair to the platforms, we don't actively try to just find misinformation by using words that you would see on the right, disinformation prone words. We also use neutral words that anyone could use in the discussion, like just vaccines or migrants, the very neutral versions of the words used in those discussions. And so we have half of the words in this neutral category and half in the two other categories that are more related to misinformation. So the borderline category are made of words that are often used in disinformation contexts, but not exclusively. And the disinformation prone word are the ones that are more exclusively attached to mis and disinformation narratives, such as fascism in Ukraine or climate alarmism. So legitimate sources would usually not use these words. So they are really related to disinformation. So we run all those queries, hundreds of keywords per language on all the platforms. And that allows us to collect a large data set that is representative of the posts that exist on the platforms on these topics. And we collected 2.6 million posts. And of course, we didn't analyze all of them. So I'm showing you now how we process the data to extract random samples that we are later able to annotate with fact checkers. So the random sampling, I mean, first, the big sample that we would like to have, ideally, would be, taking directly a sample from all posts on the platforms. And that is the approach, if the platforms themselves provide us with a random sample, that is what we are getting. So for LinkedIn, for instance, we have a random sample within that big black square, and we just searched the keywords so that we have, all the posts that are on the topics of interest for us. But that's not what happened for most of the platforms. We had to search, search for the posts, and as I mentioned before, we found 2.6 million posts. And so it might not necessarily be exactly, the same as all the posts that do exist on the platform. Maybe the search is hiding some content, so there can be a little bit of bias introduced here. But still, we have a lot of posts with a lot of views. As you can see here, we have 24 billion views in total on all these posts that we have collected. So it's not, trivial or a small amount. It's these posts that we have collected represent a lot of the discussion that is happening on these topics. And then what we did was take a random sample of the posts that we are going to annotate within the ones that are on the topic of interest. And we took 500 per platform per language. Now, it's important to know here that we didn't take these posts purely randomly. We didn't want to end up having to analyze just tweets with 2 views, right? So we weighted the samples by views, meaning that a video or a post that has 1 million views is 10 times more likely to be picked in our random sampling than a post or a video with 100K view, right? So the bigger videos, the more influential content are more likely to be annotated by our fact checkers. And you can see that by the statistics on the left here, we have 12,000 posts that we are going to analyze, so much, much less than the 2.6 million, but still they represent 3.8 billion out of the 24 billion views, right? So it really shows that we look at content that has a lot of views overall. Now, to measure the first indicator that is called prevalence, let me first remind you about the definition that was given by EDMO, so the European Digital Media Observatory. In their report, they published several reports to define what these structural indicators should be. And in their second report, they explain that prevalence needs to be an indicator that measures how widespread disinformation is. So it's pretty straightforward. It's just the share of content identified as disinformation, disinformation as defined by the code of conduct in a random sample of content. And we have to compare this disinformation post with posts on the same topics, not all non-disinformation content. So this is exactly what we have done. And I'm going to show you in the rest of the presentation. But first, again, I need to show you the definitions of what we used in terms of categories that were available for the fact checkers to label content. So the fact checkers labeled these 12,000 posts in the different countries. And the options included labeling something as mis and disinformation is if there is clearly stated or implied false or misleading claims. So basically, it's the way fact checkers would work, when they have partnership with platforms. It's following this kind of definitions. Then, of course, we can have credible information. So information coming from credible sources that really inform readers about what's happening in the world. So we have a category for that. And then a lot of what we find on social media is not verifiable. So we have this category as well for everything that is opinion or this kind of content. Then we had to introduce this also additional categories because we realized not everything was fitting in these 3, even though we are going to focus mostly on these 3 in the rest of the presentation. But still, for transparency, we also defined this borderline category whenever a post was feeding a narrative, a misleading narrative, without specifically being stating explicitly something false or misleading. And we also have this abusive category for everything around hate speech, insults, promotion of harmful behaviors. So anything that we don't want to label as either misinformation or credible, it doesn't fit any of these categories. And then we have other categories that we then exclude from the analysis. So that's pretty important. And anything that is irrelevant for our topics, for instance, because they speak about COVID, but not about COVID-19, the disease, but just the period, for instance. So we might have a sport commentary, including the word COVID, but not talking about it. And we exclude that from the analysis. So we are going to really look at posts that talk about the topics we care about. So for you to understand exactly those definitions, here are a few examples of one post, for instance, labeled as misinformation. And here you would recognize a familiar face in the English-speaking world, but it's also translated in Europe. And this person was making claims that vaccines are toxic, basically. So this is the straightforward case that goes to misinformation. Credible source, a credible post would be, for instance, this one that explains something about microbiology and is coming from a credible information source. Now, something that speaks about the topics we care about, for instance, curing cancer, but with a perspective that we can't verify. So, for instance, the story of one person and how she claims to have cured cancer is relevant for us, but it's unverifiable. So it goes in this category. The borderline category here is an example here of a post that was marked as such in our dataset. So we see, a picture of a boat on a beach with people running. So it's pretty obvious that it speaks about migrants, especially with the text below that speak about illegal immigration, but also, makes implications that basically all the migrants are coming with violent intentions. So it's stated here that they come without tanks, but with knives. So this is something that is not specifically misinformation, but is feeding this kind of narrative that migrants are criminal in general. And finally, the abusive category. An example here is the kind of insult against people from Asian origin, for instance, here calling that person yellow. So a way to denigrate people based on their race or origin. And this goes in that abusive category. So now that I have defined all these categories, here are the results of what's the proportion of the posts that were labeled in one of these categories on each of the main platforms we analyzed. So as you can see, on some platforms, such as LinkedIn and Instagram, most of the content is credible. So maybe it's good news for if you're using those platforms. And a lot of the content is also unverifiable. So on some platforms, such as these two, most of the content is not necessarily problematic as understood by misinformation or abusive content. But on other platforms such as X, for instance, or TikTok, the proportion of credible content is already much lower, pointing to a first issue on these platforms. And you can see that misinformation and also especially abusive content on X, Twitter is highly prevalent. So it shows that already with this first picture, we can see that different platforms have different profiles of risk and also of the content that are viewed on these platforms. Now, if we want to speak specifically about the prevalence, that metric that was defined by Edmo, what we chose to calculate here is the ratio of the number of posts that are classified as misinformation and disinformation divided by the posts that are misinformation plus unverifiable plus credible. So excluding the other problematic categories from the equation, just to focus on what's misinformation as compared to other kind of legitimate content which are credible or unverifiable. And with that definition, what we find is that the platform with the highest prevalence of mis and disinformation is TikTok, with about 20% of the content on the topic of interest to us and in these 4 countries that are labeled as misleading or false by fact checkers. Then we have all the other platforms, Facebook, Twitter, X, YouTube, and Instagram that are kind of in the middle at around 10%. And on the other end of the spectrum, LinkedIn with 2% of prevalence of misinformation. So that result was pretty shocking for us, like surprising, especially for TikTok. I just had a quick look at the results for the second round of annotation, and we confirmed that figure for TikTok. So it was not just a one-time thing, although we will need to, wait for the end of the analysis to definitely publish those results. But it looks like it's not a bug here. It's really strong, and we have checked this, in many ways. And I'm going to show you one of the way we did check this and to inform our confidence interval that are shown here. So this is what I'm talking about. What we did was to look at what the fact checkers, whether the fact checkers would agree if you ask a second fact checker independently. So basically, we took all the content that was annotated by one fact checker, and independently, we gave it to a second fact checker to label it. I mean, not all of it, but 20% of the post was cross-labeled in this way. And as you can see, the agreement rate was pretty high. So it reinforces our conclusion that what we show is not a bug. It's really a feature of the platforms. And even though you always will have disagreements between humans rating the same content, in our cases, we are pretty strong on these results. Now, regarding the topics that we found as mis and disinformation, I think it's always interesting to understand the nature of the phenomenon we are dealing with. What we saw is that a lot of the content that is labeled as mis and disinformation is about health. So it's a lot of bad advice, health advice that are made as in the form of videos, and those creators benefit from it, maybe because they are selling fake remedies or cures or these kind of things. Then you have the Russia-Ukraine war that is 25% of the disinformation posts in our dataset, and that the reason behind that might be more related to propaganda pushed by potentially Russia in that case. And then the other topics are a bit less prevalent in our dataset. So if you also care about LLMs and whether they can be used in such work, what I can say briefly here is that LLMs are quite reliable when it comes to identifying whether the posts are relevant or not to our analysis. So we use them to filter out some of the posts in our dataset, and that worked pretty well. But LLMs are not reliable when we try to replicate what the fact checkers do, right? The labeling of the fact checkers in the different categories is not really something that the LLMs can master. And we also realized that LLMs, the use of LLMs was pretty expensive. It took time for us to set it up, and it's actually when you scale it to analyze tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of content, the costs are too expensive to really apply on a large scale. Now, I want to tell you about the second indicator. So I spoke about the prevalence of mis and disinformation. Now I want to speak about the sources. And again, we are following the EDMO definition about what we should measure. And what is said here is that we should measure characteristic of the accounts that repeatedly share mis and disinformation. So I'm going to show you something about the number of followers they have. And I'm comparing those sources of misinformation, labeled here low credibility, by comparing them to high credibility accounts. So accounts from established media and scientists, scientific organization, this kind of accounts. And I'm going to show you also, in addition to the number of followers, the number of interactions they get for each of their posts and per follower, like normalized by the number of followers they have. So briefly here, we have used two approaches to get those lists. One was to ask the fact checkers for a list of high and low credibility sources. The other approach was to take the top 50 accounts in our dataset of 2.6 million posts, so the accounts that posted the content with the most view in total. And we asked the fact checkers to also put them in the low credibility, high credibility, or neither category. And because both approach gave us the same results, we merged those datasets. And here is what we find with those datasets. So we looked at the average number of followers of the high credibility and low credibility accounts. And you can see that on all platforms, high credibility accounts tend to have much more followers than the low credibility accounts. So that is the first result. And it's strong across all the platforms. So in general, established media have a larger audience, potential audience on these platforms. Now, when we look at how many interactions these accounts were getting for all their posts, normalized by the number of followers that they have, here is what we observe. On all platforms except LinkedIn, we see that the low credibility accounts now have more interactions for their posts than the high credibility accounts. So this is true on Instagram, on TikTok, on X, on YouTube, on Facebook. It's only on LinkedIn where we have little data for the low credibility accounts, so we can't say anything about the difference. So this is a pretty striking results showing that the low credibility accounts are treated more favorably in some ways. And we can quantify this by looking at the ratio of the red to the green bar. And this is what is displayed here. So the ratio of how much more interaction the low credibility accounts get compared to the high credibility ones is what we call the misinformation premium. And the value is 8 on YouTube, 7 on Facebook, and it's getting down to 2 on TikTok and 1 on LinkedIn, which basically means there is no premium on this platform. And this is the only one. So on all the other platforms, structurally, if you want to get more interaction for the post you're publishing, you better be a source of misinformation. That's basically what this is saying. Okay, I'm going to skip this one and talk to you about the monetization, which is the third structured indicator we have developed. So what we want to do in this is to measure, to see how the platforms are potentially respecting this commitment that they signed on the code of conduct, that they should reduce financial incentives for the production and dissemination of disinformation. So what we would need, and that is a problem with this indicator, is that we don't have enough data. What we would need ideally is to know the revenue that is generated by a given account. So we can compare the amount of money that credible and low credibility accounts are getting. And we ideally also would like to know what content is monetized, but we don't have anything of this sort. So instead, what we had to look at was to look at accounts that we know are eligible to monetization because those rules are public on the different platforms' websites. So we look at whether an account is eligible for monetization, and then we look at whether we have signs, credible evidence that each account that we have in our dataset is actually monetized. And we were able to do that only on Facebook and on YouTube. We also have data about Google Ads. So we looked at websites related to the source of low and high credibility that we have on platforms. So it's a little bit of an extension. But yeah, we have data only for Facebook and YouTube. Facebook, because it has a library that is public about who is monetized and who is not. and YouTube because we were able to collect the data on whether there is an ad before or around the video that is played. And the results we got here is that on Facebook and on Google Ads, you see that the amounts of high credibility and low credibility websites or accounts that are monetized is higher for the high credibility ones when you compare it to the low credibility ones. But on YouTube, we don't have any difference. So it means that on YouTube, there is potentially no effort that is made to decrease the monetization of accounts that repeatedly share mis and disinformation. So this is the only thing that we were able to get. Again, it's not as ambitious as we would like it to be, but it's mostly linked to the fact that there is very little data available. And if you have any idea about how we can get more data about the monetization of different accounts on different platforms, I'm happy to hear from you. So to finish this presentation, I'm sharing just a few recommendations here that come from this report. What we would like to recommend is to make this kind of structural indicators more a routine kind of supervision of the platforms. As I just hinted during my presentation, we have the first results for the second period right now, and it shows with the results that we have that we get strong results in the sense that they are consistent with what we got in the first period. So that's pretty important. Yeah, stay tuned for the publication of the second report in the beginning of 2026. Another important recommendation is that we need to have an enforcement of this researcher access. So in theory, the platforms should give us access to data, but they don't, right? So we apply for these platforms and we try to get the data, and in the second round of measurements, it's the same as in the first. Only LinkedIn and TikTok cooperate to some extent, and all the other platforms just ignore our requests. And finally, what ideally would be good would be to have some standard ways for the platforms to publish random sample of the content that is on the platform. In that way, we would not need to go and ask again and again and again to the platforms to give us data. They would just publish it, and it could be a requirement from them. So I'm happy to answer your questions now. And yeah, if you have any follow-up on this presentation, any idea for how to do it better, I'm happy to hear from it. Thank you.
Thank you for the insightful presentation. It's indeed a very important study because it helps us understand better the amounts of disinformation circulating on these platforms. But I also think that the methodology and your experience with accessing data is, I believe, especially valuable for other researchers. So I would like to open the floor to our Q&A session. And one of your recommendations was about the need to include such indicators as a part of routine supervision for platforms. And I think that kind of ties together with the first question, which is regarding the fact that platforms themselves don't disclose such numbers. Is that maybe because they don't know themselves how much is on their services? Should they know, and how should they measure and disclose it?
So I'm not sure if this question refers to monetization, but I guess that is what it is. So I think if it's monetization, the platforms know how much money they are making for some content. I think they know how much money they are paying to the creators of content, that's for sure, because they have to transfer the money to them. So yeah, for the monetization, they must know some things. They must know at least how much they pay those creators. Now, it's possible that they don't know exactly how much money one video is bringing to them, maybe, or how much money one content creator is giving to them, because there are some indirect effects as well. So yeah, it's true that there are some data that they will not have. They will probably not know exactly, for instance, how many views a given video on their platform is getting because people are just asking for that video or because they get it through recommendations, they might not store all this data. We don't know as long as we don't have transparency. So yeah, I mean, we keep asking for things that are pretty simple. I mean, random post, random sample of posts, some basic data that we're pretty sure they have. But yeah, it's true that there might be some limitations to the data that they are collecting.
Thank you. We also have a question from Giovanna Fleck. Thank you for the recommendations. I'd be interested in discussing how you envision organizations working on information integrity, implementing those, considering funding cuts and limitations. Suggestions are welcome.
I would also welcome suggestions because I mean we are in the situation now where the amount of funding is just decreasing. For instance, the funder of this project was the EMIF, and their funds was coming mostly from Google, and Google didn't renew, or up until now we don't have any confirmation, and most likely they will just not give any more money to anything related to disinformation. So anything coming from the US is better considered dead now, which is pretty problematic given the size of their, the amount of money they were supporting in this ecosystem before. So, I mean, I can't really share any suggestions now if, potentially countries, governments in Europe might want to step in and fill the gap. Maybe some other philanthropy efforts might do that. But yeah, that's the best I can say for now.
Yes, thank you. And then we have one section. Yeah. So another question, to what extent you're able to identify the disinformation that goes beyond the predefined topics and issues you look at and in your data collection, and how much of it is repetitive?
So mostly because of our methodology, we filter content that are on specific topics, right? So we will we will find potentially misinformation, disinformation on those topics and not on others. That's just by construction. So we can't really go beyond the topics that are, the conflict in Ukraine, climate, health, except for a very small portion of data. And as you might have seen on the graph that was showing the proportion of the different topics, health is the first one, but there was a small one, 3%, that was other. Because sometimes when we search post, we find something that is related, but the main topic is something else. So we have a little bit of that. Now, in terms of the repetition, in this study, we didn't do a lot of deep dive into what exactly is being said in those mis and disinformation. But in the other study I mentioned at the beginning on climate misinformation in the French media, on TV and radio, we have done that. We have looked at 529 cases of climate misinformation we have collected, and we clustered them using an LLM to see what is the message behind that. And we find that there is a lot of repetition actually. So out of the more than 500 cases, 120 just speak about one thing. So yeah, there is a lot of redundancy, at least when it comes to climate misinformation. And finally, all those topics were chosen by the fact checkers. And in the last category, the national politics, they have more freedom to include any topic that they think is relevant in their country. So it's not just those topics that we are looking at. It's a little bit more broader than that, especially now in the second measurement period. We will have other topics just because the fact checkers are including more keywords about what is potentially important in their country.
Thank you. And if repeated misinformers consistently receive a misinformation premium, does this suggest that platform architectures themselves are optimized, even unintentionally, to reward harmful content?
Yeah, I think this is exactly what we we highlight. Um, to make sure this is really the case, what we could do is look at how much more interactions each content is getting, right? What we have done is at the account level. So it's possible that there are some confounding factor, such as the misinformation accounts. They are also the ones that use more emotion, even in their non-disinformation content, and maybe that performs better. So we don't say definitely that we have a link between, the content is mis and disinformation, and so the platform is rewarding it. But we could measure that in the future. And there are scientific studies that show that, for instance, algorithm, like recommendation algorithm, especially one study I have in mind on X from somebody called David Chavalarias. So you can find his study. So it was showing that the content that was more emotional and more likely to have hate speech or hate related content was more likely to be surfaced in the feed of others that were following this account than any type of other content. So they looked at the content level and they simulated everything that an account could have seen based on which accounts they are following and what is the content that they actually see in their feed. And so they see the overrepresentation of some content and the underrepresentation of others. So this directly shows that the recommendation algorithm is giving priority to content that is hateful, for instance, on X. We have evidence of that. But more indirectly with our study, what we have is evidence for a broader effect on all the platforms, except LinkedIn here, that all these platforms, algorithms tend to reward content that is coming from accounts that spread misinformation. So yeah, more studies might be needed to definitely say this is exactly the recipe of these algorithms. They favor this or that. What we do know is that they favor, in general, emotional content that triggers emotional reactions, these kind of things. And that relates to misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech in general.
Thank you. And another question more about the methodology again. How did you define a narrative in your methodology?
So in this specific study, we didn't really define a narrative, except maybe in the category of borderline. When we label something as borderline, the definition is that it's feeding a misinformation narrative. So, there is no specific definition here. Again, it's what the fact checkers would say. Again, in the other study that I mentioned about climate disinformation in the media, we clustered all the cases of misinformation we found in what we called narrative. So, but basically, it just means the message that is behind it. So for instance, a lot of false information on climate would try to send the message that renewable energy is going to increase the price of electricity. And that is what we call a narrative. So it's just this general abstraction of the main message. But then you can have many claims, specific claims that say different things, but they feed this same message. So it's, yeah, to define it, it's just the message that is underlying many misinformation or disinformation individual posts. And when you do study that, again, you can use an LLM to say, what do all these posts have in common? What is the common message? And it's going to be a pretty good evaluation of what's a narrative here. So that's the short answer to how we usually define this.
Another, I think, really interesting question. Have you been able to map specific profiles or sources amplifying harmful content within the teams you selected?
Not really. We did not specifically look at the accounts and what kind of profiles they had. So there is a lot of variety here. It's easier on the credible side because usually whenever the fact checkers say, okay, this is a source, I've checked everything they post and it's accurate. Usually they are mainstream media or established media. Some can still publish misinformation, but usually this is it for the credible source. For the misinformation sources, it can be any kind of pseudo media, um, I don't really have a name here in mind, but also it can be just influencers that are on these platforms and that get a lot of followers. Um, I remember we saw like former doctors or these kind of, nurses. They have some sort of medical uh, authority, but then they use it to to make money on these platforms. So they just say things that are inaccurate, and that's how they become famous and get money. So I mean, we don't have yeah a typical profile of the sources of misinformation other than that.
Thank you. We still have time to take a few more questions. So, how to apply findings to future fact-checking efforts when findings point to more audience for credible accounts, but not guaranteed engagement. Do you still see value in fact-checking or alternative narratives, or do you see other avenues?
Yeah, I definitely see the value of fact checking because this is still something that people search, uh, especially now with large language models, LLMs. I know because our website is saturated with bots crawling the website that those LLMs, they get the fact check. So even if it's not directly reaching the audience, it might be also indirect, like the media will search for a fact check when there is some sort of events that they don't know. So it might be something a little bit more indirect, but it's still, kind of providing evidence for a broad ecosystem of actors. And now also what this shows is that potentially the fact checkers, but also the media might need to adapt to this new reality, either by trying to perform better on these platforms or by developing other models. Like honestly, I think that is really what's needed now is to develop models where you can reach your audience without having to rely on these platforms that have, increasingly made it hard for the credible sources to find their audience there. So that would be my recommendation.
There's also a question if there will be a recording. Yes, there will be a recording on YouTube and on our website. And then we have so far last question. Could you talk a bit more on what was X's reasoning for non-alignment with Article 35 of the DSA? I understand that that was the reason they denied the access to data.
So I'm not familiar with Article 34 precisely. So if you know what exactly it says, please tell
Article
me.
34, I think it's listing what are the systemic risks that platforms should report on in their risk assessments, and it's also one of the requirements um, for the research
Mm,
to.
okay. So I mean, I can't say anything about X's reasoning because, of course, we are not in Elon Musk's head, and he can do things that are seem, you know, hard to understand. But what they have done is they have pulled out of the code of conduct on disinformation altogether, right? So they completely said we are out of that. We are not going to even try to do anything. So I don't know what's their reasoning, but I think their course of action is to do nothing, to not share data, not share any effort they are going to do. So yeah, I mean, we have seen the change because in the past they were part of the code of conduct on disinformation, especially before Musk purchased the platform. But yeah, after that they kind of just said we are out of that. So I think they probably will intend to not comply with the DSA at all. That's my understanding. Yeah, I don't have insiders knowledge of what's going on in the company otherwise.
Yeah. And we got another question. Can we track disinformation campaigns and know their sources?
So I mean, it's not mostly our job, but some people do that. So I can say that to some extent, yes. And I think it's also the OSINT community that are doing this kind of work. So I just have one example where we try to find the origin of some of the climate misinformation narratives that we observe in France. So we did something very simple. We just searched online on search engines, where we could find some key words, some key numbers that are given in the misinformation to track it back to where it first appeared on the web. And in the case of France, we identified one think tank that was, publishing 2, 3, 4 years before everybody else some specific numbers, such as renewable energy is going to increase your electric bill by 50%, right? It's a talking point. They kind of say it first, so they potentially created it. And then we could see that in the media, this talking point was repeated. So, I mean, the best I can say is this, that there are some actors that are paid in this ecosystem to create this information. And it can be states, like it can be maybe Russia in some case, or another country, maybe China, if they have an interest in doing that. Or it can be think tanks that are paid by lobbies, like fossil fuel industry lobbies in the case of climate change disinformation. And so they create talking points, and then they potentially pay influencers or speakers to go and talk and spread those talking points in the media, in social media. So in some cases, that's the origin, although it's always hard to prove. And in some cases, the disinformation campaign might just be organic, right? Somebody says something on a social media platform and they just realize it works well in the sense that it gives them a lot of likes and views and money for the content they created. So they just create more of that. So what we observed during the COVID-19 pandemic was that there was a person on YouTube creating videos that were just, not false, not very interesting. So they had very few followers, very few views. And from one day to the next, the person started publishing things that are more conspiratorial, right? Saying COVID vaccines, just be careful because there might be this, or this kind of tone, like I've heard that this is potentially true, but maybe not. And so as soon as the person started publishing these YouTube videos, the number of views skyrocketed. Like the person's changed from 5,000 views on average on this video to 100K view. And so that's just showing that by design, the platforms just reward this kind of content. And so the campaign is created by the algorithm itself, if you want. It just triggers the curiosity of the audience.
Thank you. I think it was a very interesting question and answer session, and we're very precise on time. Um, Thank you again for joining us today. And I will invite you to join us also for our next webinars. The next one will be on January 15, Pop Fascism, Memes, Music, and the Digital Revival of Historical Extremism with Coral Garcia. And on January 20, we will have a webinar on climate deception on air with Luna VMR. Thank you again, Emmanuel, for the very good presentation and for answering all of the questions. And see you next time.
Thanks a lot
Thank
for the
you.
invitation.
Bye.
Bye.